Some things disappear quietly. No explosion, no final broadcast, no wreckage washing ashore. Just 3 men on a rock in the Atlantic, and then nothing. And then a boat arriving to find the lamps still clean, and the table still set, and the island offering no answer to any question put to it. The Flannan Isles are not a place that welcomes visitors. They rise from the North Atlantic roughly 20 miles off the western coast of Scotland, a cluster of dark basalt formations that spend most of the year wrapped in low cloud and sea spray. Sailors had avoided them for centuries, not out of superstition exactly, but out of the reasonable understanding that rocks that size, in water that unpredictable, were best given a wide berth. The lighthouse, built on the largest of them in 1899, was meant to change that calculation, to make the surrounding waters navigable at night, to put a human presence on a place that had never really wanted one. 3 men were sent to keep it. James Ducat was the one in charge, a lighthouse keeper of more than 2 decades who had the kind of quiet authority that comes not from rank, but from repetition, from doing the same careful work in the same careful way until it becomes something close to instinct. Thomas Marshall was his assistant, younger, still building the kind of experience Ducat had already accumulated. Donald MacArthur was a substitute, filling a temporary gap in the rotation, an older man who had done this kind of work before and had no particular reason to expect this posting to be different from any other. For more than a year, it was not different. The Hesperus made its supply runs on schedule. The lamp burned. The logs were maintained. Reports came back from the island the way they were supposed to, routine and unremarkable, the administrative paper trail of a lighthouse doing exactly what a lighthouse is built to do. Whatever the Flannan Isles were before the light was built there, they were functioning infrastructure now, a point on a nautical chart, a reliable rotation of light through the dark. The Hesperus left port on the 26th of December, 1900, carrying supplies and a relief keeper scheduled to rotate one of the men off the island. Captain Harvey had made this run before. He knew the approach, the particular difficulty of landing on Eilean Moor in certain sea conditions, the usual protocol for announcing arrival. As the island came into view, he watched for the flag that should have been raised on the pole above the compound. The pole was bare. The island looked the same as it always looked, gray and wet and indifferent, except that nothing on it was moving. Harvey sounded the horn. The sound crossed the water and came back with nothing attached to it. He waited the appropriate amount of time and sounded it again. No figure appeared at the cliff edge. No light moved behind the cottage windows. A small boat was lowered and a keeper named Joseph Moore was sent ashore, walking the path up from the landing the same way he had walked it before, expecting to find the men waiting at the top or visible somewhere on the grounds. The path was empty. The compound was quiet in a way that was different from the usual quiet of a remote island. It was quiet the way a room is quiet when you realize no one has been in it for a while. Moore opened the cottage door and entered. The kitchen was orderly. This detail might cause concern for a careful reader. Items were in their proper places. Food preparation had begun. The usual signs of 3 men living and working in a small area were evident, though the men were gone. Moore searched the cottage, finding the same emptiness in each room. He went to the tower and climbed it, but discovered nothing. Returning, he stood in the entryway observing the 2 sets of oilskins hanging on their hooks. This heavy, waterproof clothing, which Ducat and Marshall would have worn in severe weather, remained as if they had only stepped out briefly and would soon return. More crew came ashore from the Hesperus. They covered the island with the careful attention of people who understood there were not many places to look, and wanted to be sure they had looked at all of them. Eilean Moor is small enough that a thorough search does not take long. They found no sign of accident or injury inside the station, no indication that anything had disturbed the order of the place. What they found at the western end of the island, near the crane platform used for supply landings, was damage to the iron railings and displaced equipment and torn turf at the cliff edge. the kind of evidence that suggests a wave of significant size had reached that point at some recent time, when exactly, relative to everything else, could not be said. Robert Muirhead arrived shortly after to conduct the formal investigation on behalf of the Northern Lighthouse Board. He was the man who had appointed Ducat to the posting and knew him as a professional, which perhaps explains the particular care with which he documented everything he found. The logbooks were intact through the 15th of December. The lamps had been cleaned and prepared. MacArthur's oilskins were missing, suggesting he had gone outside before the other two, though whether they had followed him or preceded him or gone separately was not something the evidence could resolve. Muirhead wrote everything down and reached a conclusion that satisfied the administrative requirement for a conclusion without fully explaining anything. His official finding was that all three men were likely moved from the western cliffs by a wave while checking or securing equipment. It was plausible. It accounted for the missing oilskins, the cliff damage, the absence of bodies in an ocean that frequently does not return what it takes. What it did not account for was why Ducat and Marshall had gone outside without their waterproofs in December on an exposed Atlantic island, or why the mainland weather records for those days described nothing severe enough to threaten experienced men on a cliff they knew well. Muirhead filed the report. The board accepted it. A new crew was sent to the island. The lamp continued its rotation. The question of what actually happened on Eilean Mor in the middle of December 1900 was filed alongside the report, and quietly left there. The logbook entries from the final days are the part of this story that researchers keep returning to, not because they provide answers, but because they raise questions that the official record never bothered to address. Marshall's handwriting fills the last few pages in a way that is noticeably different from the earlier entries. Tighter, more urgent, the kind of writing that comes from a hand that is moving faster than usual. The entries describe a storm. 3 consecutive days of it, building in intensity, waves striking the western cliffs with a force that Marshall found worth documenting in language far more vivid than a lighthouse log typically contains. He wrote about the sound of it, the way the rock seemed to absorb the impact and return it as vibration through the floor of the cottage. He wrote about the men's state of mind in terms that no routine maintenance report would ever use. The mainland weather stations recorded nothing matching that description. Ships operating in the broader region during the same period logged rough but ordinary North Atlantic winter conditions, the kind of weather those waters produce routinely. Nothing that would cause experienced men to write the way Marshall apparently wrote. The gap between what the log describes and what every other record from those days confirms has never been satisfactorily closed. One explanation is geographic. The Flannan Isles sit in a stretch of open ocean that can generate localized conditions entirely invisible to stations on the mainland coast. The geometry of the western cliffs creates wave behavior that has surprised visiting researchers even in calm periods. Water funneled and amplified by rock formations in ways that do not read as severe on any instrument located elsewhere. It is possible that what Marshall experienced was real and simply unrecordable from any other point of observation. Another explanation is harder to quantify. 3 men, isolated on a basalt rock in the middle of winter, dependent on each other entirely, with no contact with the outside world between supply runs. The psychological dimension of that situation is not something the Northern Lighthouse Board's report addressed at any point, because it was not the kind of variable that official investigations in 1900 were designed to consider. What prolonged isolation does to perception, to the interpretation of ordinary sounds and sensations, was not part of the framework. What is documented is that by the final log entry, something had shifted in the tone of the record. The last lines are brief, almost clipped, as though Marshall had less to say or less certainty about what to say. The entry ends without the usual closing notations that lighthouse logs of that period typically included. It simply stops, mid-rotation, the way a conversation stops when something interrupts it and the speakers never come back to finish the thought. The question of MacArthur's missing oilskins has attracted less attention than the logbook, but it is in some ways the more puzzling detail. The working assumption in Muirhead's report is that MacArthur went outside first, which is why his gear was gone, while the other two sets remained. But this reading requires Ducat and Marshall to have followed him outdoors in December without stopping to put on their waterproofs, a decision so contrary to the instincts of experienced maritime workers that it strains the explanation built around it. Some researchers have proposed that the sequence was different, that Ducat and Marshall went out first for a reason that required speed, and that MacArthur, who had his oilskins on, went after them. This would place the missing gear on the last man out rather than the first, which changes the implied narrative in ways the physical evidence cannot confirm or deny. The cliff edge kept whatever it saw. The ocean returned nothing. There is a detail from Moore's initial inspection that appears in some accounts and not others, which is itself a small mystery of the archival kind. Several sources mention that a chair in the kitchen had been knocked over or was found displaced from the table, suggesting some movement of sudden or unplanned character. Muirhead's report does not mention this. Whether it was present and omitted, absent and invented in retelling, or simply noted informally and never entered into the official record, is not something the surviving documentation can clarify. That kind of gap is common in cases like this, not because anyone is concealing anything, but because official investigations record what fits within their framework and leave the rest at the margins. Muirhead was looking for a cause of death, not a complete account of the final hours. He found enough to write a plausible conclusion, and he wrote it. And everything that did not fit neatly into that conclusion remained exactly where it was, in the logbook, in the layout of the kitchen, in the absence of two sets of oilskins from their hooks, waiting for someone to come along later and notice that the pieces do not quite form the shape the report suggests they do. The lighthouse on Eilean Moor was automated in 1971 and has needed no permanent human presence since. The stone compound still stands, maintained at a functional minimum, and the light still turns through North Atlantic nights on its programmed schedule, indifferent to weather and season and the question of what happened inside those walls in the winter of 1900. Nobody lives there now. Nobody has for a long time. In the decades between the disappearance and the automation, the island was staffed continuously by rotating keepers who were aware of the history and largely chose not to engage with it. A few accounts survive from men who served there in the mid-20th century, brief mentions in letters or informal interviews, and the consistent thread running through them is not fear exactly, but a kind of attentiveness. A heightened awareness of sound and weather that they attributed to the place itself rather than the story attached to it. One keeper, writing to a family member sometime in the 1950s, described the western cliffs as feeling louder than they should, as though the rock carried sound from somewhere below the audible range. He did not elaborate. Researchers and journalists have visited the island periodically over the years, most of them drawn by the same questions Muirhead left unanswered. The terrain is not difficult to read. The western platform where the damage was found is still accessible, the cliff edge still exposed to the same Atlantic swells that arrive without warning from hundreds of miles of open water. Standing there in poor conditions, even briefly, produces a physical understanding of how quickly the situation could change, how little margin exists between the rock and the water at that point. What those visits have generally confirmed is that the wave explanation is not impossible. The cliff geometry on the western side of Eilean Moor creates the kind of hydraulic conditions that coastal engineers describe carefully and non-specialists tend to underestimate. A swell of sufficient size, arriving at the right angle, can push water to heights that bear no obvious relationship to the sea state visible from a distance. Men who knew the platform well might still have miscalculated, especially if they were focused on securing equipment and not watching the horizon with the attention the situation required. But the oilskins remain, and the meal remains, and the log remains, with its descriptions of a storm that the broader record does not confirm. Each of these details is individually explainable. Taken together, they form a picture that is coherent in outline and persistently unclear in the middle. The way old photographs go soft at the center while the edges stay sharp. The explanation exists somewhere in that softness. It has not been found. There have been formal re-examinations of the case at various points, the most detailed conducted in the 1990s, when improved access to Scottish meteorological archives allowed researchers to cross-reference the log entries against a more complete record of regional weather patterns. The findings were inconclusive in the specific and mildly supportive in the general, suggesting that localized conditions in the Flannan Isles area during that period could have differed meaningfully from mainland observations without those differences being captured in any surviving record. This is not the same as confirmation. It is the kind of finding that keeps a question open without moving it forward. The families of the three men received the official verdict and, as far as the historical record shows, did not publicly contest it. Ducat left a wife and 4 children. Marshall was younger and had fewer ties documented in the surviving records. MacArthur, the substitute keeper who had not even been scheduled for that particular rotation, left behind almost no paper trail at all, which is perhaps the quietest detail in a story full of quiet details. That the man whose oilskins were missing is also the man about whom the least is known. What the case has accumulated over the centuries since is not evidence, but interpretation. Layer after layer of reasonable inference applied to a fixed set of facts that have not changed and will not change. The logbook says what it says. The mainland weather records say what they say. The oilskins were where they were. The cliff was damaged in the way it was damaged. Every theory built on those facts is trying to fill the same space. The 11 days between the last log entry and the arrival of the Hesperus. A period for which there is no record of any kind, not because the record was lost, but because no one was left to make it. The island does not hold the answer in any mystical sense. It is rock and grass and the ruins of a functional building, subject to the same physical laws as everything else. Whatever happened on Eilean Moor happened for reasons that were ordinary, in the way that most human endings are ordinary. A decision made under pressure. A misjudgment of distance or timing. A moment that moved faster than the people inside it could respond to. The extraordinary part is simply that no one was there to see it, and the sea ensured that no account of it would survive. The Hesperus returned to port after leaving a new crew on the island. Captain Harvey filed his reports. The Northern Lighthouse Board issued its findings. Newspapers covered the story briefly and moved on to other things. The light on Eilean Moor continued to turn, as it continues to turn now, and the western cliffs continued to meet the Atlantic on whatever terms the Atlantic chose to set, as they had before the lighthouse was built, and as they will long after the last of its machinery stops working. 3 men went out there in December of 1900 and did not come back, and the only record they left is a logbook that describes whether no one else remembers, sitting in an archive somewhere, its final entry incomplete, waiting for a question it cannot answer. Some cases do not close. They simply grow quieter over time, until the silence around them becomes so complete that it starts to feel like resolution. It is not. The Flannan Isles file is still open, in the sense that matters, because the people who could have closed it never came back from the western cliffs, and everything since has been the rest of us reading the last pages they left, and trying to understand what they were looking at when they stopped writing.